All right. All right, so I guess I'm going to start out by asking, who here does front-end web development? All right. Who here has used React? How about Vue? All right, Angular? Wow, decent number of Angular people. Okay, who has heard or used Marco? Yes, a few people, all right. Okay, so Marco's new, and just to make it clear, I am the creator of Marco. We do have a team at eBay that's working on Marco, so it's not just me. But we are competing with these like heavyweights, like Vue and React. But they're all very similar, so that's kind of one of the things that I want to talk about, is that how are they similar, how are they different? And hopefully, you'll learn a little about each of the frameworks. So I will be talking probably a little more about Marco, but I did also want to give some important details about the other UI libraries out there. All right, so just some information about myself. So Michael mentioned I work on the platform team at eBay. So actually, it's the Node.js platform team. And within the Node.js platform team, we work on various open source projects. We have tons of teams at eBay that do develop different parts of the site. And we work with those developers to help them build the site so that it's robust, it scales well, and that they're happy, right? So it's really about making developers happy. So as a side job at eBay as well, I also work on the open source program. So I'm a huge open source advocate, and I want to get more people contributing to open source. I think it's good for individuals, it's good for companies, and I'm working with different teams at eBay to help them do a better job of open source, which means community, actually code quality testing, and all those sorts of things. So probably the biggest open source projects, which I have a lot of them, a lot of small open source projects, but the biggest ones are going to be Marco, which you'll hear about tonight, and then Lasso, which is actually, I like to compete with things that are big, but it competes with Webpack. So Lasso is a JavaScript module bundler and asset pipeline. If you're interested, check it out. And then Morph DOM is actually one of the things I experimented with to do DOM diffing. But let's jump into it. So just to set the context, I mentioned I work for eBay. I just kind of want to make it clear. So eBay does have pretty massive scale. You can see the numbers here. Like, it's kind of crazy how many transactions go through the site and how many users are on the eBay site and expect things to work flawlessly, right? So our website is critical to our business, and it's not just our desktop website. We also have a mobile web, and there's lots of users obviously on both sides of all the types of devices. So for those that are web developers, you kind of know what it means to be a web developer. So we build user interfaces. And this all seems really simple, right? So we build user interfaces that run in the browser using web technologies and backend data. Pretty straightforward, right? So it's a lot more complicated than that. So we have to build reactive, fast, and accessible user interfaces that render on the server, but run in all browsers on all devices using evolving web technologies and frameworks and libraries. And the backend data, of course, comes from unreliable data sources. So it makes our jobs really difficult. And that's something, at eBay, we're always trying to find ways to solve these problems of developer productivity and having issues like if you don't develop things the proper way, right? So what does the eBay front-end stack look like? So it's evolved a lot over time. When I joined eBay, it was primarily a Java shop for both back-end and front-end. So we had a stack, it was the Java Raptor stack is what we called it. So that was our own internal proprietary with a mix of a bunch of open source technologies, including JSP. We also open sourced the JavaScript library at the time when there was NPM was starting to get more popular, just a bunch of utilities called Raptor.js, which I've actually talked about a long time ago. And then jQuery was also huge at that time. But jQuery, one of the problems with it is that you write imperative code to update the view. So over time, at the beginning, it can feel nice, right? You're writing code, things update. The problem comes when you have these apps grow in size, and then trying to track down a bug because the user did this with steps A, B, C, and then now you weren't testing for that, and you had to go, and it's hard to reproduce problems. So jQuery, one of the things that React did is that they showed us that making the UI basically a function of your state makes things a lot easier to maintain. But so eventually we switched to Node.js. So Node.js is now the primary, it's like the recommended stack for doing front-end web development at eBay. So that's great because it's basically a web browser running on the server, which really does mean that we get to share a lot of code between our server and the browser. We get to do server-side rendering very easily. And we also are using Marco as the view layer, so for both server-side and client-side rendering. And Node.js has been, I would say, a huge success at eBay. So this is a Node.js meetup, so I think you guys will appreciate this. But we have tons of teams building apps, web apps, on top of Node.js. And I should also clarify that we're using Java as the backend, and we're using Node.js as the front end. You could use, I think Node.js is a very good use case for like middle tier, where you aggregate data from different places. But at eBay, we're primarily using it for the front end. So right now we're on Node.js 6. I guess now that 8's out, we'll probably transition to using Node.js 8. We have over 200 applications, so that's every team at eBay works on their versions of their code independently, pushes out parts of the site on their own release schedule, which has its own challenges. But it does mean each team gets to make decisions on how they design their app. So we get to kind of see what works and what doesn't work. The platform team's relatively small, so it's 7 developers. I'm one of those developers. But we've overcome that because actually we've kind of adopted like this whole open source mentality of teams collaborating together. So even though there's a platform team, developers on other teams are still actually contributing back to the platform and making it better. So it's very much a joint effort. And so we do have a very vibrant internal community within eBay. All right, so this is kind of just a high-level view of what our stack looks like. So at the bottom, you have Node.js. On top of that, we're using Marco for the view. We're using Lasso for putting all the assets into the browser, so images, JavaScript, CSS, all those things. And we're using Express, but honestly, Express is probably the least interesting thing. You could swap it out for something else. We don't even use it for the routing. It's just basically there to handle the HTTP request and gives you a few nice things on top of it. And then we have a bunch of platform modules, and then the web application code that our developers write sits on top of that, building pages, components, and services. So pretty standard stack. So I want to kind of dive into a little more about Marco before I expand and talk about some of the other UI libraries. All right, so this is kind of the high-level features of Marco. So some of these look familiar because we've actually been evolving Marco over time. And so if we see a good feature in React, we'll bring that into Marco. If we see something nice in Vue, we'll bring that into Marco. And we want to bring in all the good ideas, but also improve wherever we can. So we do have single-file UI components. We have asynchronous and streaming rendering on the server, which actually was really important for eBay, but it gives us like these pages that load instantly. So if you're fetching a bunch of backend data, this data comes in at different times. And if you were to wait for the slowest request, then your page is going to be, you're not going to start sending bytes down to the browser until that slowest request completes. So we can get away from that by having asynchronous rendering. So we start rendering the page immediately, and as things start to come in, they start rendering and flushing down to the browser, which I think is really interesting. And that's great for the server, but in the browser, you don't actually need features like streaming because you're in the browser. So we actually switched to a different way of rendering in the browser, which I'll touch on later, but we actually render to a virtual DOM in the browser, which is what React does. And these things combined give us best-in-class performance on both the server and in the browser, so we try to optimize for both use cases. And another thing that we've really wanted to get right with Marco is have like virtually zero boilerplate. So you're not worrying about all the like extending a class and putting in all these complex method names and having all these weird libraries that you have to bring into your app and build complexity in your build chain. So we want to keep things as simple as possible. And I think if you can see here on the right-hand side, is that the syntax is about as minimal as you could possibly make it. It should look familiar. It's JavaScript, HTML, and CSS combined there in a single file. You can also split it, but that's the basic overview of the syntax. And it's also small. So we didn't want Marco to be some bloated library that would actually hinder performance, especially on mobile where connections can be very spotty. So it's 10 KB gzipped. All right, so I mentioned that Marco it's relatively new. Someone's cheering, okay. Yeah. So Marco is relatively new, but just recently we did have a huge release for Marco v4. This is where we basically stepped back and said, let's fix everything simplify as much as we possibly can, even if it means breaking changes, And let's just, if there's nothing more we can take away, then we're done. And we want to get as simple as possible. So we had the Marco V4 release. And what you see here with that little marker is that as soon as we did that release, it actually started to get the attention that I think it deserved. And rightfully so, because before there was a lot of boilerplate, that things that didn't quite feel right. But we got rid of all the boilerplate, and the core team has grown. We've actually hired people that worked on React, and have hired people that have worked on other UI libraries. So we have a lot of ideas and things that the core team now does a good job of staying competitive with all the other things out there. But as a whole, we actually have over 50 contributors for the entire Marco ecosystem, which is actually pretty large because there's a lot of integrations that you have to think about. And within eBay, we actually have quite a few UI components and pages that have been built using Marco. So we actually have over 13,000 UI components and pages. These are unique UI components and pages. And it depends, the traffic can vary, but easily over 1 billion URL requests per day go through Marco and Node.js. All right, so how is the Marco being used at eBay? So it's actually being used on our most heavily used page, which is the homepage. So just recently we launched a new version of the homepage, completely rewritten and using Marco. So if it can be used for the eBay homepage, I feel like it's a safe bet to say that you can use it on pretty much any high traffic page, right? And this, just to be clear, this is also rendered on the server side and updates are happening in the browser. We're also using it on the mobile web. So when we rewrote the mobile web, we're using Marco to basically keep our mobile site as fast and responsive as possible. But outside eBay, we're competing with giants, right? So React has a huge ecosystem. Facebook has done a great job of marketing React, and I think they have a huge amount of contributors. So it's hard to it is absolutely hard to compete. But where Marco has strength is it has really core simplicity that people are starting to notice. And so the ecosystem will, our hope is that it will build over time, but it takes a while to get there. But the truth is that all these UI libraries have created their own walled gardens, which is unfortunate, right? So if you're using Vue, you can't necessarily use a React component very easily. There's maybe ways around it, which I think is unfortunate. But one of the things we've worked on is a UI bridge that you can kind of bridge these different UI libraries together. So eventually we'll open source that. But that's the state of the things right now. But despite that, one thing I've noticed is that they've all gravitated towards the same paradigm for how you build web applications. And really, at the core, it's all about the UI component. And these are the building blocks that you piece together to actually build complicated applications. And components make things easy to maintain because they're independently testable. So you don't have to create these complex pages just to test pieces of your page, right? So components take input, and they produce DOM or HTML as output. And they also have a way to respond to user interactions through DOM events that get fired off by the browser. And then they can communicate upstream to parent components using custom events. This is pretty much common across Vue, React, Marco, and any other UI library that's popular today. I grayed out the API little tab here because API is what we're moving away from. So an API is where you use imperative APIs to manipulate the DOM, essentially, like what you were doing with jQuery. Now where we're going is that the state and the data is what drives the UI. So you change the state, the view automatically updates. So you're not interacting with these APIs anymore, which is really interesting. So state is what now is the most important thing. And so components can have state, but you can also have centralized application state using something like Redux. And of course, styles. So styles sit on top of components and give you all the visual look and feel of your component. They also have very similar lifecycle methods. This isn't an exhaustive list of all the lifecycle methods that you can think about when you're working with UI components, but these are common to both Vue, React, and Marco. So you have a component. When it first renders, you're going to create a component instance. It will receive the input that's being passed to it. You're going to render based on that input, and then it's going to be mounted to the DOM at some point. And then whenever it gets new input, then you're going to re-render based on the new input, and the DOM will update automatically. And similarly, internally, if you have internal state changes, that can also trigger an update to the view. All right, so this slide here was kind of showing the kind of a little overview how you get started using these UI libraries. And so one of the things I think is fair to say that with React is that they got a lot of backlash because the tool chain is very complicated. So React is split up into various modules, and they have React Native and React DOM, which is nice because you can target these other types of devices, but at the same time, it does add complexity. So they also pull in Babel. So Babel is actually a requirement to using React, because Babel is what takes your JSX code and transforms it into regular JavaScript code that can run in the browser. And then on top of there is Browserify, but even if you're using Browserify, you're going to still pull in Babel into that phase of the bundling. But yeah, and then on top of Babel, they have a bunch of like presets and plugins that you have to turn on. So Vue and Marco, they have their library, the core library that does the compilation. So there's the Marco module and the Vue module. And on top of that, when you send these, you have to compile and send it down to the browser. You would typically pull in like Vue Loader or Marco Loader. So the next row there is the CDN distribution. So can you just basically put a script tag in your browser to get Vue? You can, and you can do the same thing for React. And you can't do that for Marco because Marco is designed in a different way. So Marco is not distributed as like a single big JavaScript library. It's actually a very modular runtime. And when Marco compiles a Vue, it actually will compile to a module that only imports the parts of the runtime that it needs. So we can add features to Marco without adding bloat to our user, which is actually one of the key features that we've of Marco, and that the reason we can add features to Marco without creating weight for every single application at eBay and outside eBay. But it does mean that Marco requires a JavaScript module bundler, while the other ones do not. And the other tools also, all the tools have similar tools for doing scaffolding, so generating an application very quickly from scratch. I think they all do a very good job of helping you there. That's not right. Okay. So this is kind of a snapshot overview. Hopefully that's readable. So this is comparing React with Marco. So one of the things that I hope stands out is that the Marco code is less code, and tried to be as fair as possible to write things in the most idiomatic way for both libraries. But Marco really aims to have zero boilerplate. There's no references to Marco in the actual Vue code versus like where you have to import React and into the React code. And we'll touch on a little more on syntax, but Marco also has a lot of shorthands, because there's a lot of things that you just do as a web developer. You're constantly saying class equals, right? Or in the case of React, it's class name equals. And that's a very common thing, so we've actually adopted some of the CSS shorthands. So you can use dots class name to apply a CSS class to your HTML elements. But otherwise, I think I mentioned earlier, the paradigm and how you build your components is very, very similar. So let's compare it to Vue. So left-hand side, you see the Vue code now, and it's the same Marco code on the right-hand side. And Vue is, I would say, a little less boilerplate than React in some ways, but it still has more boilerplate. So you can form your own opinions, but I just kind of this is a snapshot overview of how they compare. All right, so if you're building UI components, each UI component is just a building block that you piece together to build your applications, right? So how you embed a UI component into another UI component is very important. All three frameworks here use custom tags as a way to embed another component into a component, right? But they do it in different ways. So Vue, I'll just start with that since it's on the left-hand side there. So Vue, you have to first register your custom tags. So you can either do a local registration, so in the same file, you can register all of your custom tags, and they also support a global registration. So I would say globals in general are a bad thing, so you want to typically import into the component where you need the custom tags, so you know exactly what its dependencies are. Globals, like, you have no idea where things came from. And so once you've registered the custom tag, you can then actually use the custom tag in the actual HTML code that you write. And it just looks like a standard HTML tag, but it happens to call out to another component to do the rendering. And you can pass it data. And the interesting thing about Vue is that it's built on top of HTML. So by default, all the HTML attributes are treated as strings, so that's why you see the colon, which tells you're telling Vue that, hey, this is not a string, this is actually a JavaScript expression, which is actually just short for v-bind, :value equals 10 in this case. All right, so moving on to Marco. So this is all the code that you see on the left-hand side with Vue. The Marco code is doing the same thing, but with obviously a lot less code. So you'll notice that you can just use a custom tag without having to register it, which may seem bad, but I'll show you why that's not bad. And it also, you can pass complex types or simple types as attributes. Actually, I'll explain that more in the next slide, or upcoming slide. So let's just move to React real quickly. So React is, I think, a middle ground between Vue and Marco. So with React, you do have to import the components into your JavaScript file in order to use those custom tags, which is not terrible. At least it's less repetition that you can see with compared to the Vue code. But one thing I just want to point out is how many times you see the word counter in that code. So there's the whole idea of like, don't repeat yourself, dry. And if you have to repeat yourself, that's kind of like a code smell, right? So we didn't want that with Marco, because when you're working on the front end, you're iterating very quickly oftentimes. Like, you're changing things, moving things. We didn't want to have to go like 5 different places to change one little thing. We want you to just drop the custom tag and you're good to go. So React, you have to import it. So you have to give it a variable name. You have to say where you're importing it from, which again is counter. And then you can finally use that custom tag in your Vue code. And that, of course, is using JSX. All right, so why does Marco not have to import the custom tag? So we don't have any imports. So imports are kind of terrible because you have to think about relative paths. So where are you importing it from? If things move around, you have to go update those paths, and it makes your code very fragile. We wanted to take that away from Marco so that you could just put things in your Vue code and it would just work. And the way we do that is actually based on our project structure. So for those who use Node, which I guess is most of you since this is a Node.js meetup, there's this concept of node modules, right? So you do an npm install, and when you actually require a module, it goes and it searches up the directory tree, and it finds the node modules directories, and that's how the modules get discovered. So we adopted a very similar thing for Marco. So instead of node modules, we call this directory components. So anytime you use a custom tag, and this is a tag that's not like a standard HTML tag, Marco says, let me see if this is a custom tag for a component. So it walks up the directory tree, and it finds the first component, and if it doesn't find it, that's an error. But if it does find it, that's the one that it's going to use. So you can have this idea of scoped components. So it's not a global space, right? It's not like there can only be one counter in every single application. It just means that when you're searching up, looking for these custom tags, the closest one wins. And I feel like this provides a really great way to actually make your code much more dry and makes your Vue code easier to maintain as a result of that. So typically what we see with eBay applications is that we have a top level, for an application, we have a top level components directory. These are components that are shared across every page and every component within your application. And you might also have route specific components. And so each route is its own directory, and within that directory you can have its own set of components that are not going to be accessible to any of the other routes. On top of that, each component can also have its own components directory. So you can create composite components that it's built of a bunch of simple components that no other component actually can have access to. So you got very much scoped access to components. And none of the other frameworks are doing this, and I think this is actually one of the best features of Marco as far as usability goes. All right. The second best feature of Marco, I would say, is the syntax, which might seem kind of minor, but we've actually put so much thought into the syntax, as well as the parser and the compiler around the syntax. And the reason I think this is important, because HTML, like I mentioned, everything is in quotes, like that's a string. And you need a schema to say that it's something other than a string, or you have to start to pull in all these like symbols to say, don't treat this as a string, treat it as a JavaScript expression. So we wanted Marco to be a nice blend of JavaScript and HTML, but we didn't want the limitations of HTML. So what we did is that we basically said that all attribute values are JavaScript expressions. So if you put 10 without quotes, you're going to get a 10, just like you're used to with JavaScript. And if you want a string, you put it in quotes. So it kind of maps that is equal to what you get with HTML. But you can also pass arrays as attribute values. You can pass variables as attribute values. And it's very clear from just looking at the code because it's just JavaScript. There's no special rules for how every attribute value is a JavaScript expression. That is not the case with Vue. And so with Vue, I mentioned there's the Vue-bind or this colon shorthand. But it makes it so that you have to put more symbols into your code. I think that detracts from how you pass data between components, which is actually very important. So React almost got it right with JSX, but they didn't go as far as they could. So by default, everything's a string, and if you want something other than a string, you have to put curly braces. So once you put curly braces, you're telling JSX, hey, this is a JavaScript expression, this is not a string, and then it parses it as JavaScript. But it means that if you want to pass like a true, you have to put the true in quotes, not quotes, sorry, in curly braces. You don't have to do that with Marco. And so these.
Actually, with React, when you're linting your code, it complains if you put true. It actually just put visible. In that example,
Right.
Visible with nothing after it.
Does it allow without?
Yeah, and that
Okay.
is equated as true.
Okay, so maybe true is not it, but even like take the curly braces where you want to pass an object to as a property, you have to put double curly braces because the
Yeah.
yeah.
That gets all the early people. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a non-issue with Marco, and also actually, since you mentioned it, if you just put an attribute name without the value, that actually is the equivalent of saying the name equals true as a Boolean, so it'll pass a Boolean value to the component that you're passing it to. All right. So a little more into the syntax here. So that's how you can pass data between your components, and this is a kind of how we mix in flow control into Marco. So JavaScript is a very powerful language, right? So React took JSX and said, all right, we're going to start with JavaScript, and we're going to allow you to put like HTML markup, which is actually XML markup, into your JavaScript code. So it starts with JavaScript and makes it more like HTML. Marco, on the other hand, starts with HTML, and then you can switch into JavaScript. So it's starting with HTML because we feel like that's closer to what you're doing when you're writing Vue code, is start with the HTML because that's the simplest thing. And you can easily eject into JavaScript mode. So if you start a line with a $, that's a JavaScript statement. It's just like writing the JavaScript equivalent on the right-hand side in the React code. And there's also this implicit render function that you can think of your Vue code as being wrapped in. So on the React side, you have a function called render, and it returns a value. So that's just boilerplate that you kind of put in all of your Vue code. You have to wrap it in a function. So with Marco, you just write your Vue code, and that's what renders. And you still get to use the full power of JavaScript. There is still a blend, though, so we have, like, if you need to do conditionals, we want to make it look as much like JavaScript as possible, but it actually it's using HTML tags to do if conditionals, but it actually uses parentheses so that it stands out. So it's kind of a blend between HTML and JavaScript. And then Vue is very similar. Yes, another question.
Is there any performance advantage to you using your for versus a map?
So the compiler, we can tweak at any point. So the for code, we have full control over how it compiles into code. So it actually supports different variations. And we actually optimize it so it can generate, in some cases, a native for loop, but in some cases it also generates a for loop that's calling like basically a for each. But it's optimized. I don't know if that answers your question. There are performance advantages because so maybe I'll explain a different way. So with what you get with React, how you write your code is going to control how it performs. With Marco, how you write your code is how you describe your Vue. How it actually compiles to JavaScript and how it runs is actually completely in control of Marco. So we can put optimizations at any step very easily. I suppose you can do that with like Babel plugins that maybe can rewrite your code, but the Marco compiler actually does a lot of work behind the scenes to optimize your code. And Vue is actually very similar to Angular in that you basically do v-if or v-for, and then you put it in quotes. So it's not terrible by any means, but that's the style they have. And you also see an example of using v-bind to set the background color. So is this readable? I hope it is. I don't know if it's, to me there's a glare, so hopefully you guys can see it better than I can. But very similar. And the other thing I want to point out is that Marco lets you use flow control like tags, directives if you want to call them that, but you can also use these directives as attributes. So depending on like your preference, really, what it comes down to, the benefit of using attributes to put these directives is that the structure of your HTML is very clear. There's not all these intermediate layers of indentation. And you can clearly see that this element here is the one conditional element. And when you put a for attribute on the li, it's repeating the for loop. It's repeating the li for each iteration of the for loop. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. So we also have a concise syntax. So for those who are familiar with Jade or Pug, it's all based on indentation. So the idea is that you have a tree structure. Why do you necessarily have to put beginning and ending tags if you can just base it on indentation, which is a great way to represent a tree? So Marco, within the same file, you can choose which syntax you want to use, and it can be a developer preference. But you can drop the angle brackets, you can switch to indentation, but otherwise it's pretty much identical to using the standard HTML. Interestingly, I think that within eBay, the jury is basically saying that people prefer HTML for whatever reason. So they like the familiar HTML syntax, but Marco supports both. All right, so DOM events are really important when you're building a UI because that's how you handle user input and user interactions. So with Marco, I'll just start with Marco, is that we didn't want to hijack the onClick attribute, so you can still use onClick equals and put something in quotes, and that just falls back to a standard onClick that you with standard HTML. But if you do onClick and put it in parentheses, that's telling Marco to handle this event listener for you. So the first argument to the event listener is actually the method name. So in this case, you say onClick and then in quotes increment. So whenever the user clicks on that button, it's going to call, Marco will delegate that event to that method on your component instance. This will always be the component instance. So if your component has other methods or properties that you need to access, this will be what you expect it to be. And you can also pass additional arguments to your event handler method by putting any comma and any set number of arguments that you want to pass to, which is very similar to like doing a function bind. So then I'll jump to the React code. So React, you can do event listers in a very similar way, but you're passing around a function. And so when React calls that function, unless you use .bind, this will not be what you expect it to be. So you have to kind of think about if you're binding a function, an event to a method, you have to bind it to this, and then you can also call .bind to use bind to pass any additional arguments to your event handler method. And so jumping over to Vue and Marco are very similar, where you pass in the name of the method you want to call, as well as any additional arguments you want to pass to it, and they also have a special $ event. So the $ event is the standard browser event that was actually fired. So if you need to read the real DOM event, you can do that very easily with both Marco and Vue, as well as with React. All right, so custom events. So custom events are what allow a UI component to communicate upstream to other components. So the DOM, you can think of HTML elements like a select is actually a component. So these events that the DOM is giving you are just like events that the browser gives you, but your component can also have its own events that need to go upstream. And Marco uses the event emitter API exactly the same as what you get with Node.js. So every component actually extends event emitter. So you can call emit, and you can actually, on any component instance, you can call .on to actually, or .once, or whatever you need. But you can also do the declarative event binding. And it works the same as both for DOM events as well as for custom events. And it's also the same thing with Vue. So Vue makes it the same how you subscribe to DOM events. It's the same as how you subscribe for custom events. However, so React is different. So React is a little different in that you pass around functions. So if you're in a component and you want to emit an event, you can't just call this.emit. You actually you need to say, as part of your input, you would have been given a function to say, call this function if this event happens. But you don't know if the user of your component, is actually telling you to call this event. So you have to first check, do I have this event, is this event listener method as part of my input? If so, call it with any set of arguments that you want to provide it. And of course, you have to be careful because you're calling it without saying this, without this being the component or whatever they might have expected. So the user of your component is responsible for binding that event handler function to this if that's important to them. So it's just one of those things that kind of trips up, I think, a lot of developers who are using. JavaScript in general has the problem like this can be wrong. And that's what I'm kind of like emphasizing here, because you don't have that problem with Marco. This will always be the component instance if that's what you want it to be. All right, so the client-side rendering API, which means if you have a top-level UI component where you need to bootstrap your application, you need to mount it to the DOM, and then when you mount the top-level component, it'll automatically mount all the nested components as well. But for the top-level component, each of the UI libraries has their own way of mounting the component to the DOM. So Vue, you have to create a new Vue instance, and you give it a reference to the component that will be the top-level component. And then one of the properties of that, when you create new Vue, you pass it in the element property, which is a reference to either can be a string, which can be used as a selector to target a DOM element in the DOM, or it can actually be a DOM element. But in either case, you can mount your component to a DOM element. So the interesting thing about Marco is that when the template compiles, it compiles into a module. You can import that module into your JavaScript code, and one of the methods that module exports is a render sync method. So you can say render sync, and you can, I don't show it here, but you can pass any number of input data props to your component. It'll render it, and then you're like, okay, I've rendered it, but now where do you want me to put it into the DOM? So one of the methods is append to. You can also call replace child or replace children. There's different methods that give you the ability to easily insert it into the DOM, but you don't have to use, there's no importing of Marco in order to render a Marco file. So once a Marco file gets compiled into JavaScript, you don't actually need, the user of your component doesn't even need to know that it's using Marco. So I put .marco in the file extension here, but that was just to make it clear. When a component gets compiled, it becomes a .js file. So it becomes index.js. So you can import it just like any other JavaScript module and use it like you don't have to worry about how it was implemented. So it's a black box. All right, so React is very different. So you build a React component. If you want someone else to use your React component, you have to say, use the React DOM module to render that React component. And of course, you can wrap this and maybe simplify it so that you provide an API to do this automatically, but you get it for free with Marco. And the reason that you have to import a special module with React is that React has a different way of rendering on the server versus in the browser. So I'll show you that in the next slide. So I mentioned that Marco is isomorphic. So Marco is isomorphic. But on the server side, you're not mounting to a DOM. What you typically want to do on the server side, you can either render to a string, which is just giving you HTML markup, or you can actually render to a stream, so like a writable HTTP response stream. So in the example here, where we have a function that takes as arguments the request and response, you can then render directly to that writable stream, and Marco will take care of ending the stream whenever the rendering completes. So I mentioned that Marco is asynchronous, so you don't notice if you're fetching backend data asynchronously, it's not going to be like the very next line that you're done rendering. So it'll take care of ending the stream whenever the rendering is completed. And it also takes care of flushing to the browser, flushing the stream to the browser whenever it makes sense to flush it. So let's talk about Vue. So Vue also supports server-side rendering. Frankly, their API is pretty awful. For some reason, you have to import a Vue server render. Then you have to create a renderer. And then after you create the renderer, you can then get a method that can be used to render that component to a string. And then once you have the string, you can basically then say response.write that string, and then you can end the response. So you can certainly do server-side rendering with using Vue in all these libraries, but it's much simpler, and you get a lot of performance gains when using Marco. So then let's talk about React. So React, you have to import a different module. So instead of React DOM, you have to import React DOM server. And with that module, you can use that. It exports an API that allows you to render any component to a string. There's a few other other methods, but rendering to a string, you can also do it also puts a bunch of things into that output that allows when you boot up in the browser, that it can kind of pick up where it left off. All right. So I'm going to pick on Vue for a little bit. So Vue has evolved a lot over time. And one of the things I will say about Vue is that it gives you lots of options. Because it tries to cater to different types of users, but it does it in a very different way. So let's take a look at some examples. So if you're defining a UI component, you can create an object, and one of the properties is a template. And it can be a string. And that is something that Vue will actually use to compile that string into your component. But working with strings can be pretty awful because new lines, but you can use string literals. But in either case, you kind of lose syntax highlighting unless you somehow special case it for your editor or IDE. So the advantage of this, though, is that you don't need a build step. So Vue has a compiler that it can ship to the browser, and it can read that string, and it can compile it on the fly into an actual JavaScript code that can be used to render the component. But you typically would not want to do it this way. But it's one of their use cases. So the other use case, because writing HTML inside a JavaScript string is pretty awful, they also support the use case of putting your template in your HTML file somewhere. So in your HTML that on the page, you have one element, you give it an ID, and you can just put the template code inside that HTML element. And because the browser doesn't know what that is, you have to give it basically script type equals text x template. So it's like the browser just ignores it because it's not for the browser, it's for Vue. But the problem is now you have this disconnect. So you have your logic over here inside this JavaScript code, and then you have your HTML template in another place. And then also if you're working on these things in parallel, you're going to litter all of your HTML with all these components that are just disjointed. So that's not ideal. So then they introduced single file components, which simplifies a lot of these problems, but now it's just one more option that they have to support. So you can use a single file component which has a .vue extension, which means it has to be compiled on the server. So there's definitely a build step in order to use a single file component. But it gives you, within the same file, a nice separation of your Vue logic, your JavaScript logic, and your styling, which works out pretty well. You can also, if you so choose, because these things may grow over time, it can go large. You have two options if that starts to become unwieldy, is that you can break it up into smaller components, or you can just say, I'm going to move the JavaScript into a separate file, and I'll move the CSS into a separate file, perhaps. And then you can keep your Vue code inside the file if you want. And then they also thought it would be a good idea to let you pick and choose any sort of language that either renders to HTML or renders to CSS. So you can use LAS or Sass, which is not bad, but the thing that it allows you to use Pug. So by supporting Pug, for example, and there's other ones as well, you're basically tying yourself to an HTML way of defining your view. And there's some weird things that I don't even want to go into, but it's actually well, maybe I will. So Pug actually, this code is actually at compile time rendered by Pug into HTML, and then the Vue compiler is it will interpret the actual rendered HTML at compile time. So it's not like it's using Pug at render time, it's done at compile time. All right, so the final thing that came much later is that I think it's I'm just kind of assuming here that they saw React and JSX, and a lot of people really like JSX because it felt like you got to use the full power of JavaScript. So they said, okay, well, let's just support JSX. So they support all these options as a way to define the view. They all actually get kind of compiled down into the same thing. But at the same time, you can't necessarily optimize for one way or the other because they have to equally support all of them unless they deprecate and introduce breaking changes. So Vue lets you use JSX. So it's kind of flexible, but at the same time, there's lots of options. All right, so I also mentioned earlier that you have two ways of registering a UI component. So you can do local registration, which is a lot more boilerplate, or you can use global registration, which is less boilerplate, but at the same time, it makes your code harder to follow. So it's like, which the two evils do you pick? And it's up to the developer. All right, so kind of shifting gears to talking a little bit about Marco. So one of the things that working at a large company like eBay is that we have lots of different teams building UI components and building complex web applications. And we wanted to make it as easy as possible to catch errors early. So if in your editor IDE, you should be able to see if there's a problem with your Vue code as opposed to waiting till you load your page up in the browser, then you see something that's happening. So we put a lot of effort into tooling. And one of the things that we have, and this is for Atom. So Atom is awesome because it's written in JavaScript. So it's easy to hack on. So I like JavaScript. I can go into Atom, create plugins that do some really awesome things that piggyback off of other plugins. But autocomplete is something that we support in Marco for Atom. And it's the suggestions are actually driven by the tag discovery. So as you're walking up the directory tree looking for all the components, you're only going to get suggestions for any components that are actually available to that particular file. We also have support for snippets, so you can do all sorts of, it's a lot of interesting things with autocomplete. And so this is an example of the snippets. So common things like conditionals and looping. It gives you a bunch of, you can skip a lot of the boilerplate code by just selecting one of the options and it'll generate the code for you. And you can easily tab and fill in the actual data. All right. The other thing that I want to show you is that, so hyperclick. So when you're looking at your Vue code and you want to jump to the definition for where another component is actually implemented, you can just click on the custom tag and it'll take you right to that file so you can jump between your projects as hyperlinks. And that's a really nice plugin for Atom as well. Yes. All right. It's only Atom. I'm not sure who asked that question, but it's only Atom. The question was, is that only for Atom? And right now, it's only for Atom. A lot of developers, I will say, at eBay use WebStorm. WebStorm is awesome, except it's all Java. I used to do Java in a past life. It's the API for writing plugins in WebStorm is just, it's insane. So hopefully, assuming Marco continues to gain popularity, they will be incentivized to actually work on a Marco plugin. So one day. The other thing that we have is PrettyPrint. So developers, definitely try to write code that is well formatted, but as you're working on Vue code, it's easy to start things get messed up and lose alignment. And PrettyPrint basically will format your code with some rules that you can actually control the rules, but it'll actually just nicely format your code. And I don't know if anyone's used Prettier. So Prettier is something you want to take, you often don't really want to give developers flexibility to how they format their code because it's better to have consistency. So PrettyPrint is something that we're exploring with basically just on save, just PrettyPrint everything so that you have consistently formatted code throughout your entire application. But it's available as an Atom plugin. There's also CLI, so command line interface that you can use to do the PrettyPrint. So I mentioned async. So async is a really nice feature of Marco. And how it works is that, so if you're in JavaScript, you have promises. You also have callbacks, but we support both. But I'll just show the promise example. So if you have a promise will eventually resolve to a value. So it's an eventual value. And if you have a part of your Vue code that is waiting for some asynchronous data, you can hand Marco the promise. And eventually, that promise will resolve to data. And when that happens, Marco will then finish rendering that part of your template. But it means also that it doesn't just, when it's going through and rendering your program, it doesn't just stop and wait there. It actually finishes rendering, but everything after that, a wait block, is just buffered up. And Marco takes care of that for you automatically. And then it'll take care of flushing out things in the proper order. It also supports out-of-order flushing. So with out-of-order flushing, if something at the bottom of your page renders on the server and it completes first before something higher up, you can flush it, or you can flush it first. So it actually will be sent down to the browser first, and we use JavaScript to automatically move it into the proper place on the page without you having to write a single line of code. And I mentioned the page weight. So Marco was designed to be as small as possible. And compared to Vue and React, it's the smallest. So React is getting smaller, but it's still very large for a UI library. There are alternatives to React, like React and Inferno, which are much smaller, but just pulling in React here because that's what we're talking about. And Vue is just in between. So the page weight matters because, especially on slow connections, and it's easy as a developer to forget about how important it is to keep your size small, because we assume that we have a fast connection because we have a fast connection, that everyone has a fast connection because we have a fast connection, but definitely on cell phone that's not the case. And in like other countries where the infrastructure is not as good, it becomes important. All right, so it's small, but it's also really, really fast. I'll explain why it's fast, but it really has to do with how we compile the templates for both the server and the browser. So these are our benchmarks. We made every effort to be unbiased. So we created like a different scenarios, like different types of UI components and pages. One of the benchmarks that we created was a search results benchmark. So eBay has a search results page. We implemented the search results page in Marco, Vue, React, as well as Inferno, React. And we ran the benchmark, and Marco was significantly faster on both the server and in the browser. So the far left you see the server side, so under Node.js, and the middle one here is for desktop, and the far right is for on a mobile. And we actually averaged both iOS and Android for the mobile, just because we want to keep it as small as possible. But across the board, Marco won in every single benchmark, and we're always trying to make it faster. So why is it fast? So the compiler that Marco has does a lot of really interesting things. So when you're rendering on the server, I mentioned that it's better to support HTML streaming because that's how you send the Vue code down to the browser. It's via sending an HTML string, streaming it over the HTTP response. So this is how a template gets compiled for the server. It basically compiles to a render function that this is the code that it generates. So it's very readable JavaScript code that you can see, but this is what executes. So it's almost as like you wrote code to render something. You would have written it in a very similar way. All right, so that's for the server side. But for the browser, the same compiler will actually generate different code. So we parse it into an AST, and then at compile time, we just have a different code path for the final stage, which is to, instead of rendering to a stream, we actually generate a program that will actually create virtual DOM nodes. And I don't go into depth in virtual DOM nodes, or virtual DOM and why it's important, but virtual DOM is what we render to, which mirrors the real DOM. And when we need to update the view, we compare the virtual DOM to the real DOM, and we make the changes to the real DOM based on what the differences are. So that's for the browser side. And the other thing that we can do a lot of static code analysis to optimize how the view compiles. So what you see here is that you have a view, some template code at the top, and it's always going to produce the exact same output. So why would you generate all of those virtual DOM nodes every single render? It would be wasteful. So what Marco does is it recognizes the largest static subtrees and will create the virtual DOM node once, and then every render, it just inserts that into the output. So it's virtually zero cost for rendering static parts of your template, which is actually a large part of your view will be static. So that's why benchmarks are tricky, because they will actually depend on how you write your code. So having real-world benchmarks is actually kind of an important way to measure the actual rendering performance. Another interesting feature about Marco is that it kind of has always started as like a focus, like let's get server-side rendering as fast as possible, but we want the browser to pick up right where the server left off. Which means that if you render a huge tree of components on the server, when you get to the browser, you have to mount all of those components in the browser. So you already have the HTML markup. So why would you re-render everything to get the same exact HTML markup that you rendered on the server? That would be wasteful. So what you do, so Marco will send down the HTML markup, of course, but then it also will send down the state and any other information that it needs to recreate the component tree in the browser with minimal effort. So it can mount in the browser as fast as possible. And it's seamless. So you don't even have to think about how this handoff from the server went to the browser. You don't have to write extra code. There's no framework required. Marco does it for you automagically. So that's all I have. And any questions? All right. So you can absolutely use ECMA 6 inside your, wherever you can put JavaScript inside your Marco, you're free to use whatever you want. Of course, if you use ES6, you're going to want to probably use Babel if you're targeting older browsers. And so you would run Babel on the compiled code, and that will give you code that can run in all browsers. Yes?
Seems like there's a lot of really distinct advantages here. Do you find that the pared down syntax ever gets you into a place where you have limited functionality where you would want it, or what are the downsides of using this?
So are there any limitations with like the syntax? And honestly, no, because one of the interesting things that it didn't go into at all here is that we actually expose you can have full control over how templates compile. So you can create a custom tag, and you can say, this is the JavaScript code that I want to put into the output, and Marco will let you do that in a very declarative way. So you think about components as something that renders at render time, but you can also say, let's say you put Markdown inside your view. You can render that Markdown into HTML at compile time so that you don't even do that at render time. So we found that the syntax lets you do pretty much anything you want. It's kind of like Babel. Like it gives you the hooks to let you can introduce all those like directives that I showed you are just built on top of the API that we exposed to the public. So you can create your own directives if you want. Like we have for and if, but if you want to like repeat or whatever you want to call it, you can introduce that very easily. Any other questions?
This ties to his, but a lot of stuff, maybe it's under the hood, and you don't see all the code, and do you sacrifice a little bit of readability, or do you think the stuff that you're supplementing is very readable anyways, trying to write code for yourself and others?
So readability, does it sacrifice readability with Marco? Yeah. I don't think so, because it's basically boiled down to the simplest possible way to describe that code. I mean, it's just HTML for the most part, right? That's
yeah, when you're looking at React and Vue, it's kind of like, yeah, if you know what's happening, you can read it.
right.
But if you're iffy about it, it's kind of a lot of,
Yeah.
and if you take all that away, it could be
Right. And with React, there's like certain things with JSX, like every time you enter into JSX land, it has to be an expression, which means that you have to like start to think about like how you break up your view code into a bunch of functions, so it becomes like spread out through 50 functions. And if you look at the same thing in Marco, it's very top down. So you can very clearly see this is the HTML structure that is going to be generated, and you can easily tweak it as you see fit. You're not going to 20 different functions. And so obviously, I mean, JSX is not terrible. I mean, it wouldn't be popular if it wasn't terrible, but I do feel like Marco, the readability is one of the clear advantages with the syntax. But yes. So Marco, good question. So I'll just say, so Marco, starting with how long has it been around? So Marco has a long history. Probably back like 2012 is when we started on the first version of Marco, which was back then called Raptor Templates, because at eBay we had the Raptor stack. But we open sourced it. It was based on, it required well-formed XML. It's evolved a lot over time. We pulled in the ideas of React. We pulled in the ideas that we saw in Vue that looked good. And every change we've had to be very careful with how we improve the language, but we've always kind of migrated teams to use the latest version of Marco along the way. And you were asking about other companies. So the other companies, so Marco v4 is probably when we start to see a lot of interest in Marco. But I can say like other companies have reached out to us and are using it either as like, I don't know what extent they're using it, but like Yahoo was asking us questions and was using it on different pages. Gov.uk, a bunch of startups actually. We have, I think I showed you like 385 people in the Gitter chat room. So there's all these people from different startups, and we have a list, but I would love to publish like which companies are using it, but I've never asked permission like, hey, can you use your logo or anything. But I feel like there's probably at least 40 companies I have on the list that I know of that are at least experimenting with Marco or using it in production. Yes, question behind you.
Are there any conflicts with using NPM for all the packets that you can import? I mean, like, are there any packets for Marco?
So the question is like using NPM has a huge ecosystem. Can you use all those NPM packages? Are there conflicts? So the really cool thing is that you can import any JavaScript module into your Vue code. There's no restrictions there. As far as like the Marco ecosystem, so eBay has an open source, not open source, an internal UI component library that we've talked about open sourcing. But one of the things that I think is like kind of makes it difficult to move to Marco, and something we need to probably work on, is that people want something that's like easy to get started. They don't necessarily have to go build components like date pickers or color pickers or whatever it might be, right? So I would say that the ecosystem for UI components for Marco is tiny, which, honestly, like, especially for eBay, it's not like we can just like use any component out there. It's gonna pretty much have to be kind of adapted to work how we expect it to work on our page. It needs to have the exact same look and feel that we want to have. But if you're building an internal tool, you don't care as much. You're like, if it's material design, awesome. Just needs to look nice. So we've talked about creating a UI component library wrapping material design, and I think that's something we'll do in the near future. But yeah, so there's not a lot of UI components out there, but you can use the entire JavaScript ecosystem. You can publish a Marco UI component to NPM, and you can easily import it. So within eBay, the teams publish everything to NPM, and they pull in code from different teams. So we have shared UI components, we have shared modules that every team is using. Any other questions? What time is it? I'm probably sure we're way over. Oh, actually, it's not too terrible. It's almost 8 o'clock, so.
Couple more. I guess speaking of like competition and saying one to learn something like this, would you say it's I want to say disadvantage? So many people know React and Vue, and maybe not so much Marco. But getting bigger, that's great. But if you write something on a team,
Right.
everybody on the same page, is that the kind of the uphill valley?
That's the uphill battle. And the walled gardens don't help. So the walled gardens, like once you go with one, you're kind of stuck because they're only interoperable for the most part with each other.
It's like, I'm a student saying, it's like, oh, I know Marco, and everybody's like, well, we don't.
Right. So then a lot of people will choose a library because of hiring. Like they want to pick something and learn something that they know there's going to be jobs for, right? So that's the challenge. And like it's a really tough space to be in. It's worked out really well for eBay, and like within eBay, everyone, I can honestly say, the feedback has been really positive for Marco. And teams have absolutely used React and have used React to like just had a scratch an itch, and then they come back to using Marco, and they're like, especially with Marco v4, they're like, wow, that's so much nicer. I find that when I'm working on Marco, it's like it's really, obviously I'm biased. It's really simple. Like you just write your Vue code, you write methods, you handle events, and it just works. Like the surface area for the API is tiny. Yes. So we actually have another eBay developer who I work remotely. He also works remotely. So we're out in Colorado. So.
So I'll just put a plug in there. Having worked on several different stacks over the years, I'm almost 2 decades into building web apps now. By far, the easiest that I've ever built front-end components is with Marco. And I've been doing it a long time. So this is for me, the best way to do it.
Do you see this speed as being, I don't know.
Well, speed is essential for eBay right now, right? The competition out there for the largest, this isn't stable. So the competition out there for these, us in the space that we're in as one of the largest web properties out there, speed is crucial for us. And for us in Marco, we see that benefit. Where
I would love to know. I,
Is it like such a huge corporate burden to train so many developers on this kind of platform?
No.
And it's like,
Actually,
what
people
is
come in who are either fresh out of college, meaning they don't have a lot of experience in any of the platforms, right? Or they come in from other companies and quickly ramp up. Like there's not a lot of time that they have to spend ramping up. Now, documentation is key, and that's coming along, and we've seen a huge improvement in that over time. But generally speaking, very quickly, because the separation of concerns is right. You see your template, you see your rendering logic and your events, right? So it's very easy to pick up because you understand all the pieces that are happening.
Well, you can say it's like easy to pick up, but like how difficult would it be to restructure the whole setup from React or Vue to Marco?
yeah.
Yeah, you could probably speak to that. You've seen
Is
systems
that
do
more
that.
of the
Yes. So it's funny. There was one person in particular that they decided to use React, and which it's fine. Like if someone wants to use React and it's like not for like a heavily used page where the performance may not matter as much, go for it. Use React. And so this person used React, and we had a later. It's like I'm not liking React. I want to switch over to Marco. So I worked with this developer, and it actually for the most part was just like a direct translation. But in every case, it was just like much less code. And it just worked the first time.
It looks like you're not even manipulating too much. It's just like deleting.
Yeah, it was honestly just delete boilerplate, gone, gone, gone. All right, there's what actually matters. I honestly feel like that's how you build your Vue now. You just focus on what matters. You don't have to think about the internal details. And actually, I see Marco getting smaller over time. Like, we want to remove features. We don't necessarily want to add features because we want to keep just the focus on what the important things. So yeah, I don't know.
Do you see this going really? I mean, I'm sure you guys might. Do you see this going really far? Because what I want to say is like what you're saying with slower networks and whatnot is like just pushing this on developing actually is like so hard.
So we actually have, so eBay is huge. We have different companies within eBay. We have like StubHub, eBay Classifieds, which eBay Classified UK, eBay Classified Australia. We have emerging markets. And some of these teams like also had gone like using React and like realized that like React was never designed to render on the server. Like you can do it, but it's order of magnitude slower, like 10x. When you talk about 10x, that is a huge difference. And so they've actually tried to put all these caching layers in between, and they're just like, at one point, they're just like, all right, this isn't worth it. Let's just stop trying to make this work. And so they've switched to using Marco. Another team went from Handlebars to Marco and saw huge speed up for the emerging markets, classified actually. So yeah, I know. I mean, definitely for companies like eBay, I think performance is huge, but that's just, I wouldn't pick something just for that, like if you're just, everyday kind of, or you're just working for a standard, like smaller company or whatever, but it's nice to know that it's fast. And then if you get developer productivity on top of that, awesome. So, yeah. Yes.
Yes, so I've gotten the impression about all the good things about Marco, but are there any things that by design, not by accident, but by design, that are not optimized for Marco, and you would say, this is great, but it wouldn't be great for that?
Native, maybe. We really focus on the DOM and updating the Vue. So React has a good story for like a similar paradigm for working on React Native, which is awesome that they have the resources to do that. That's not something we focus on. In theory, it's possible. So that's, if you're thinking about building an app that could, I don't know if they say that you can use the same app run in multiple places, but that's questionable. So that's one issue. There are some gaps that we absolutely need to work on. I mentioned the lack of UI component libraries in the ecosystem, but also we've gone back and forth on so many, like scope CSS. Like we know we want to do scope CSS, but we don't want to go a strategy that is not right. We want to get it right. So that's something we're working on. We also don't have like an official router for client-side routing. You can obviously do client-side routing, but it would be nice if in some cases that there were hooks into the Vue code where you could actually have things rendered based on the route that's currently active and have things update based on the route. I have my thoughts on that, but that's a gap that we need to at least address or have some good examples. Like, here's how you build single-page apps with complex routes. You can, again,
Third party right now?
we have, so third party, the one I like is there's one router called, I think it's called Little Redux Router. And it basically, the idea is that the reason it's got Redux in the name is because when the route changes, it changes your state, and then you are responsible as a developer of looking at the state, based on this state, render this route or react to the state. I like that because it keeps it, the router code doesn't like completely infiltrate your view code. And we also have the issue because it's isomorphic. So we do server-side rendering, which has server-side routing. So how does that fit into it? So we use, like we have a routing library on top of Express, but we maybe want to use those same routes within the view code. So that's the reason we haven't like pushed for here's the official router, because there's so many kind of weird use cases that people have.
And you said Redux. That was the question I wanted to ask is, what about state engines?
Yeah, you could. So we have some sample apps. We have lots of sample apps, actually. And one of the sample apps is Marco Redux. So Redux is just a state store. When your state changes, you just tell your top-level UI component, re-render based on this new state. The connection between Redux is super simple and super easy. So teams at eBay, some teams use Redux. Some teams still do centralized application state, but they're not using Redux. Moving your state into a central place is a great thing to do. Which library can definitely vary. Any other? Yes. I handed all of them out. I have one more if you're lucky. I'll find one if you. I know. I brought a handful. Okay, good. All right. If you didn't get a sticker, you might be in luck. You can buy them online. Search for sticker Marco. Not on eBay. And I could have made money off of them, but I chose not to. So I may regret that decision. All right, so any other questions? And if you want to talk to me after, that's cool too. I'll be around, so. All right, thank you guys.